All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. Today's topic is entering the story world, and this is a kind of a focus of mine because of the fact that I do my ridiculously close looks. But basically, what it has to do with is at the beginning of any story, you are not in a story world because you're in our world, and then you have to sort of engage your brain with the story world gradually as you start to read the story. And that process is something that I find actually quite fascinating. And so I thought we could kind of talk about what it's like to experience entering a story world, and talk about maybe books that you've been impressed by, or things that you've written, or even things that kick you out of a story world. You know, any of those might be relevant and helpful. Hi, Jay.
Hey.
Yay, I'm glad you made it.
I was folding laundry.
It was touch and go
not
there.
in the diving into world building story world.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
this is where we
yep.
This is where we talk about like my very favorite genre, science fiction fantasy intro to a story, which is the first chapter of Snow Crash, right?
Sure.
With
Tell
the
us about it.
Deliberator. And I wish I'd pulled it up right now, but as you open up the book, you really have no idea what the story's about. And so Stevenson establishes, and this is a 30-year-old story now, so I'm going to say anybody who hasn't been spoiled, too bad.
Run far away.
La 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 la. The next 2 minutes are going to be cat babbling about Stevenson. He establishes the fact that he's just talking. He establishes the frame of that it's the near future, that it's set in the U.S. and he has you looking over the shoulder of a pizza delivery guy, and he lets you know that this is a world where there are still cars, but that we are in some kind of libertarian utopia, dystopia, take your pick. And that you have to pay to use private roads everywhere, and that everything has been devolved into little bird claves. And so it seemed much more exotic 30 years ago. It's a little hilarious now to look around and see how much of what he predicted has sort of become normal.
Yeah.
But it has some of the most vivid imagery that I've seen in a story to begin. And I've had a knockdown, drag out discussions with people who swear that actually the best is something by Tolkien. So there's the baseline to start with.
So what do you find cool about it? Is it it's the imagery particularly that you find cool?
It's also that he prepares you for the language of the story, that it's going to be very fast paced, that he's going to throw things at you, that he's going to throw all sorts of breakneck detail at you, and also that it's going to be full of factoids. And so it's really a first chapter that tells you, if you don't like this, you're not going to like the rest of the book. Now, because it's Stevenson, there's also the terrible thing where the end of the book is not as good as the beginning, in my estimation. But it remains my absolute favorite first chapter ever. And he never does get back into his pizza delivery car, but all the technology in his pizza delivery car lets you know what the technology of the rest of the book is going to be like.
Well,
so,
that's an interesting observation.
Pull up some of the. Okay. Let me see if I can find the first chapter to read, but we can get back to it after.
Well, so it's interesting that you were saying that the technology in the car sort of successfully represents the technology of the world. And I think that's actually something that that I find really helpful. There's something that I've noticed about a lot of books that I've read, but it's also something that I kind of try to think about when I'm writing myself, which is that the first scene of the story is often it's helpful if it's in some way representative of the entire world or the entire conflict. So I guess I like to say the first chapter should be a microcosm of the whole. That's certainly helpful for world entry. It doesn't have to reflect exactly what's going to happen, but at the same time,
I have actually pulled up somebody else's on genius.com. You can find Snowcrash Chapter 1 annotated, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, that's cool.
So it begins with, the Deliberator belongs to an elite order, a hallowed subcategory. He's got a spree up to here. Right now, he's prepared to carry out his third mission of the night. His uniform is black as activated charcoal, filtering the very light out of the air. A bullet will bounce off its arachnofiber weave like a wren hitting a patio door, but excess perspiration wafts through it like a breeze through a freshly napalm forest. Where his body has bony extremities, the suit has sintered armor gel. Feels like greedy jello, protects like a stack of telephone books. Now, the other thing that I find interesting is that this chapter has aged a whole lot, because I'm not sure my children have ever seen a telephone book.
Yeah, there are not a lot of them around at this point.
And you have to have a pretty thick stack of telephone books from my area in order for it to protect the way, say, an old Metropolitan book would.
Yeah, I think we've lost the idea of telephone books being like 3 inches thick.
Yeah,
because they all used to be, right? I mean, I remember having telephone books 3 inches thick around the house.
Well, especially, I grew up in Metro Los Angeles, so we had at least one like that. And then the White Pages was a separate volume.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is like that the metaphor he picks is so outdated, and in some ways that's something I think you run into more in science fiction than you would in fantasy, where your metaphor has to be more world appropriate in some way. So if you're dealing with a low tech society, there isn't that sense of outdatedness, because kind of literally everything is.
I think that I think that Gibson suffers even worse than this. Some of the classic Gibson. I think cyberpunk is particularly prone to this because it was creating the feel of a near future, and it was using actual numbers, which these days seem very, very small.
Oh yeah.
How much data was Johnny Mnemonic holding in his head? Now it's kind of funny because they read like science fiction westerns.
Well, I mean, so I think part of the problem is that when you are claiming the future, you are also claiming that you somehow possess the language of the future and the technology of the future. And then when it becomes the future and you didn't, that bothers some people. It doesn't really bother me that much because I think in some respects, I just think of all science fictional futures as alt futures. Where that's not the one we're gonna get. But so yeah. Anyway, hi Cliff.
I have just gone into I've just gone into my bookshelf and I'm looking at a couple of classic books of the genre just to skim through their first chapters to see what they've done.
Well, let's see. I have a book here that I know I thought was pretty interesting. So one of the things that you have to help you with world entry is the title. Because the title is your very first opportunity, right? Besides the visual of the cover. I know that we haven't talked about book covers that much, and it could be an interesting topic, but at the same time, it's not necessarily that superbly relevant to the world building question. I'm usually
book cover
concerned with
is one
words
of
on a
those
page.
topics of rage. We should devote an entire different.
But I mean, it's not world building. It's marketing. It's purely. It's like your marketing department. Blah blah blah. It's not. It's
Well,
not
it does
to do
function
with-
as
Oh,
world building,
here.
but it also functions as marketing. So
Yeah,
it has a complicated thing. I agree
But
that
it's
we
not
should have an
the
entire
artist.
hour on it.
the author is not really in charge of that though. So
No, it's
I mean, unless they're self-publishing.
yeah.
So then they
So-
are fully in control.
Well,
I wanna-
some publishers are better than others at getting the team to work together, so that the cover artist is working with the introduction to the world that the author provides.
Mm-hmm. Well, so right here I'm looking at A Stranger in Alondria by Sophia Samatar. And basically you get the sense of a traveler, right? From the title, but you don't know what Alondria is, and you get clues from the picture. And then then you've got the map, right? That can also be helpful. But then you have book 1, The Wind of Miracles. The Wind of Miracles is itself rather interesting because the words wind and miracle are very they have a very large sort of schematic semantic footprint. They're used for a lot of evoking a lot of things. And miracles, yeah, miracles are kind of an interesting item in and of themselves. I'm not going to say that they don't occur in science fiction, but at the same time, they have a sort of a magical feel to them that without other evidence might point us towards fantasy.
So I have N.K. Jemisin's The 100,000 Kingdoms here,
Yeah.
which is lovely.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love
it
that
starts
book.
with 1, grandfather. I am not as I once was. They've done this to me, broken me open and torn out my heart. I do not know who I am anymore. I must try to remember. And then there's a section break. It
Yeah.
says, my people tell stories of the night I was born. They say my mother crossed her legs in the middle of labor and fought with all her strength not to release me into the world. I was born anyhow, of course. Nature cannot be denied. Yet it does not surprise me that she tried. My mother was an heiress of the Arameri, and then it goes on from there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I think one of the things that's interesting about that opening is the choice to do the small choppy pieces, because that in itself is a major world building clue and plot clue, but you don't really see the impact of it until later.
And I have I'd forgotten how much I love the beginning of Fran Wilde's Updraft, which starts 1, Densira. My mother selected her wings as early morning light reached through our balcony shutters. She moved between the shadows, calm and deliberate, while down-tower neighbors slept behind their barricades. She pushed her arms into the woven harness, turned her back to me so I could cinch the straps tight against her shoulders. When the 2 bone horns sounded low and loud from Mondarath, the tower nearest ours, she stiffened. I paused as well, trying to see through the shutter's holes. She urged me on while she trained her eyes on the sky. So that's a whole lot of world that's in the first 2 paragraphs.
Yeah. So I think one of the issues here is how much do you try to introduce the world and how much do you just put people in it? I think we're actually so far working with things where you're just kind of dropped into the action. There isn't much of an introduction to the world as the world.
I have a counterexample.
I was
What do you
about to
mean?
give one too, but
I'm
I've
not
been talking
saying
a
that
lot.
there aren't other
Go, Cliff.
aren't explanatory types. I'm just saying that the ones we've seen so far haven't been that type.
Well, first of all, then there's the whole question of to prologue or not to prologue, because some readers just skip over prologues. But each book in this trilogy by Michael Moorcock has a prologue. It's
Yeah.
actually the same prologue, but it with variations that catches you up. And so there is the opening. There's the text proper that starts with chapter 1, where you learn about Coram and his world. But there's a prologue that is about 2.5 pages on this edition that sets the tone, and it doesn't have any of the characters for a long time. But it describes the world, but it does it so poetically that you don't mind that you're getting a description without really plot or character of the world and its history. Although the plot, the history is the plot, and it begins like this. And he had me at the first sentence, so I'll read maybe the first paragraph or two. In those days, there were oceans of light and cities in the skies and wild flying beasts of bronze. There were herds of crimson cattle that roared and were taller than castles. There were shrill, viridian things that haunted bleak rivers. It was a time of gods manifesting themselves upon our world in all her aspects. A time of giants who walked on water, of mindless sprites and misshapen creatures who could be summoned by an ill-considered thought, but driven away only on pain of some fearful sacrifice. Of magics, phantasms, unstable nature, impossible events, insane paradoxes, dreams come true, dreams gone awry, of nightmares assuming reality.
Yeah.
That's the first paragraph. None of those things are actually in the book, but they set the world in a way that I have not seen even Michael Moorcock doing and he sets his worlds in other ways, but that are equally brilliant sometimes. But that opening to that series just knocked my socks off, and it still does, because it's
I
so
wonder
evocative.
what the significance of the phrase "in those days." I believe that is a very, I believe that is evocative of maybe the Bible. Am I thinking right?
It's not biblical.
No,
It seems like
I think it's
certainly
like
not the Torah.
it gives like a
I
legend.
think it's Tolkien.
It's sort of legendary.
it could be Tolkien, but I mean, it's what I'm trying to say is it's evoking a different type of text.
Yes, and it's doing it, and I mean, it's evoking a kind of poetic text, like an Edda, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Although the Coram books are largely based on Cornish mythology. So the Mabinogion was a key text, especially in the last 3. This was the original 3, but there he draws heavily on the Mabinogion in these books, at least, especially volumes 4, 5, and 6. So there is that sense of it, and he was
so part of what I'm saying by mentioning the phrase "in those days" is that even choosing those 3 words, you're deliberately bringing to the reader the echo of some other form of literature that they've encountered in their lives that gives them a feeling of what's to come.
You're evoking the time of myth.
Well, exactly. Right.
And then the rest of the sentence is a bunch of impossible things: oceans of light and cities in the skies and wild flying beasts of bronze. Right. And so, you have, you're setting the reader's expectation. Okay, anything can happen, and does on a frequent basis in this.
Yeah, but not anything.
No, anything. Right? Like.
Well, not necessarily anything.
Stuff. Anything. Well, sure, the world has rules, but you don't know.
You've been told that it's going to be a fantastical world, I think.
I don't think I'm going to be like, ooh, Petri dishes are coming.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right?
No, it's not like anything in any
So
genre.
anything in this sort of legendary sense.
Right. Like any kind of crazy wild stuff. Right.
Yeah.
Like people walking upside down in the middle of the air or something. Right. Like,
Right.
right. There's a one point in the first book, there's a land that is perpetually on fire. There's no volcano or any other just magical fire. It's like the burning bush. It doesn't burn anything. It's just perpetually on fire.
So there's another example of a prologue that I think is kind of interesting, but it has a very different function from the one that you were just reading. And that's the prologue to the 3 books of Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern.
Okay. I didn't remember there was a prologue. So.
Yeah, well, this is what's interesting about it. It starts like this. Rukbat in the Sagittarian sector was a golden G-type star. It had 5 planets, 2 asteroid belts, and a straight planet it had attracted and held in recent millennia. When men first settled on Rukbat's 3rd world and called it Pern, they had taken little notice of the stranger planet swinging around its adopted primary in a wildly erratic elliptical orbit. For 2 generations, the colonists gave the bright red star little thought until the desperate path of the wanderer brought it close to its stepsister at perihelion. What's interesting about this is it's very distant and astronomical.
And I know why she did it that way.
Well, exactly. But what's interesting is that it's a direct contrast to
the entire trilogy
that happens at the start of the story.
Right.
Which, in the case of the one that I'm holding in my hand, it's Dragon Quest. Morning at Master Craft Hall, Fort Hold. Several afternoons later at Bend and Ware. Mid-morning Telegar time at Master Craft Hall, Telegar Hold. How to begin, mused Robinson, the Master Harper of Pern. So, like
high fantasy.
There's a disconnect there, right?
Yeah.
And she's a little prelude in reserve to kind of establish certain kinds of things about her thought process, perhaps.
No, it's marketing. At the time that she wrote it, you couldn't sell fantasy. And so she had to make it science fiction. So she put a science fiction introduction as an excuse to tell her fantasy story. And that it was absolutely the way the market was. That was like, where did that go? The FNSF or something?
It's not really a fantasy story either. I mean,
no, of course it is technically
like a fantasy story, but it is fundamentally science
medieval guilds and right. But there's a whole genre of high fantasy set on alien planets that had to do with the market in the 1970s and the 1960s that you couldn't, you just couldn't sell it. There was not the Tolkien clone market hadn't really hit. Tolkien had hit in the 60s, and it was published. Lord of the Rings was published in the 1950s. Took off with this illegal paperback edition that was all over college campuses in the 1960s, and then there was nothing else like it, until the Sword of Shannara, which was the first of the Tolkien knockoffs. But in between those, the Dragon Riders of Pern.
What?
Wait, I'm confused.
Yeah, anytime that that you wanted to publish fantasy during this window of the history of the genre, you pretty much had to make it pretend science fiction.
Well, here's the thing, though.
I'm confused.
Okay.
Go on.
Go ahead, Kat.
Maybe I need to go look at publication dates, but I remember reading a whole lot of fantasy before I ever found Shannara. Now, I saw Shannara and shiny new volumes. How old is Shannara?
Late 1970s.
Okay. Because I remember being given Lloyd Alexander and
1977, Sword of Shannara. Lloyd Alexander is kind of his own thing as well. I mean, there was this series called Circle of Light. Earthsea, the paperback edition of Earthsea said for Tolkien fans on it, because publishers were like trying to figure out what would sell to Tolkien fans. They were trying to learn that market. And it was a novel market. Dragon Riders, I think, was published in short story forms and were fix-ups. Right? Like at least the first 2.
There was also a shift because Lloyd Alexander is very firmly children's.
Yeah.
It's
right.
So there is sort of like this where fantasy novels are more acceptable in the children's market than possibly they were in like adult markets.
There was
Okay,
no
okay.
there was no fantasy genre in
This
the adult
is
market.
this is going astray.
Yeah, sorry.
Really
Okay,
is.
but
It
no,
is.
my point is that the introduction to the Dragon Riders of Pern has to do with market forces. That has nothing to do with the narrative per se. And if she
Well,
had,
actually, Cliff, if you don't
Yeah.
mind me saying so, it
Yeah.
has everything to do with the narrative because it is the
please tell me.
it is the narrative. So regardless of what was happening in the market, when
Yeah,
we encounter it now, it's
Uh,
part of the narrative, and so
sure.
it's doing something in the narrative.
Sure. I mean, it sets up the world,
Exactly,
Well,
which
but
is
it
what we're
sets it
talking.
up with a tone that is deceptive, right?
We don't go
No,
back to that
because-
science fiction framing for that world until much later.
Yeah.
I mean,
And-
we completely lose that after that first thing. And if you had told avid readers of her world that it was science fictional, anytime before the one where they find the computer came out, they would have
Right.
said, "What are you talking about? This is fantasy."
Well, I mean,
And
it's partly there. I think as a reminder of context, right?
Mhm.
So
If
yeah,
you
because you
skip-
really do have two contesting worlds that are presented at the start of the story.
but
I'm
the,
gonna
the whole
jump us.
context, the
I'm gonna
whole
jump us
thing
to
is,
something else. Is that
Okay,
okay?
let's
Or
do
do
that.
we need to have this fight? So speaking of two different worlds, I have the beginning of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone with me,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. So we have this intro that sets the world that we already know, and it's not actually set in the world of Harry Potter until many pages later when he first starts to get to the mystery of it all.
Yeah.
Yes, but Rowling has made a promise to the reader, right? That all that stuff that they love is going to be turned on its head,
Yes.
right?
So she's
Because of the way she
she's
says it.
setting you up to go, why is she mentioning that these people are so normal? So
Exactly.
it's the author doth
Yeah.
protest too much approach to setting the scene.
Yes.
Yes.
Whereas I'll just, again, not to start a rat hole, I will say that Anne McCaffrey sets up an expectation in the prologue that she sets a promise to the reader that she doesn't fulfill with the novel.
You know what? We're not talking about that.
Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to start a religious
Yeah.
one.
what Rowling does at the beginning of that book with that setting is to remark what we usually think of as unremarkable, and that is
Yeah.
the unremarkable.
Oh, let's see. I have a stack of Delaney here. Which one shall I look at? Shall we do Jewels of Aptor or Babel 17 or I and Gomorrah?
Any one of them.
Let's do Babel 17.
All right. Let me grab Babel 17 here. I knew I had a giant stack of science fiction next to my bed for a reason. Ah, yes, I'd forgotten this. The very first page after the dedication starts with Part 1, Rydra Wong. Here is the hub of ambiguity. Electric spectrums splash across the street. Equivocation knots the shadowed features of boys who are not boys. A quirk of darkness shrivels a full-mouthed dissenility, or pares it to a razor edge, pours acid nervous across the amber cheek, or smashes it in the pelvic arch and wells a dark clot oozing on a chest, dispelled with motion, or a flare of light that swells the lips and... Anyway, it goes on. So there's this sort of quote from Prism and Lens, M.H. And then the first chapter properly says, it's a port city. Here, fumes rust the sky, the general thought. Industrial gases flush
Yeah, so
the
that's
evening
an
with oranges,
internalized thought,
salmons,
right?
and purples with too much red. Yeah.
So here's a couple of the thoughts that I'm having. One is that we have world entry, but we also have character head entry, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they're done simultaneously, and sometimes they're not. I tend to like to do them simultaneously if I can pull it off, but it's always a little tricky. So I don't know. Sometimes what you're doing is you're actually looking through somebody's eyes and just observing a thing, right? Sometimes the narrator is a character, and sometimes the narrator is external to the main character.
Well, again, often a prologue might have a story about a character who doesn't appear in the book, maybe 200-300 years earlier than the time of the book, especially in a fantasy, right? So when you're writing a story with a prologue, you have to know that there's a certain percentage of readers who do not read prologues at all. That they've done surveys, and I read an article on it, and it was a crazy high number, like 40% or something. And then, so you have your prologue where you maybe tell a complete story, or maybe tell a story that sets up, the novel, and then you have your chapter 1, which is kind of another beginning and might be the beginning for some readers, right? So that.
Well, I think that you have a task. You have a task of entry anytime you start a chapter, or even a scene, because what you're doing is you're replacing the reader, and by that I mean like setting them down in a new spot every time you want to start a chapter or anything like that, right? So whether it's a prologue and you want to be placed in the prologue, or whether it's chapter 1, you want to be placed in chapter 1, or chapter 35, you got to be placed in chapter 35. It's that placement that I'm thinking about. And when you have, so I never actually read the opening of Stranger in Alondria, so I'm going to. Chapter 1, Childhood in Tiam, or Tiam, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. As I was a stranger in Alondria, I knew nothing of the splendor of its coasts, nor of Bane, the harbor city, whose lights and colors spill into the ocean like a cataract of roses. I did not know the vastness of the spice markets of Bane, where the merchants are delirious with scents. I had never seen the morning mists adrift above the surface of the green Alune of which the poets sing. I had never seen a woman with gems in her hair, nor observed the copper glinting of the domes, nor stood upon the melancholy beaches of the south, while the wind brought in the sadness from the sea. So what's interesting in this one is it's clear that this person has since figured out a lot of these things, right? These are clearly the part of the reputation of Alondria. There's a richness to the description that is just marvelous in this particular book, and it's really impressive. And it's partly, you get the sense that it's part of the way that, it's partly the way that the character listens and the things that he's learned about. So yeah, there's sort of a congruence because I guess it's because you're in first person, but it's not solely because you're in first person. You can actually do it whether you're in third person or in first. There's this congruence between the way that the character thinks and observes and judges, and the way that the words are put down on the page. And that's something that I always find kind of fun, is when there's a congruence between the character's mind and the prose.
Sure, even in a third person narrative, right?
Sorry?
Even in a third person narrative.
Absolutely. So here's the opening of Silver on the Road by Laura Ann Gilman. Part 1, Flood. Izzy leaned against the railing and watched the sunrise over the far end of town. Flood wasn't much to look at, she'd admit. Sun-grayed planks and local stone. There wasn't much point in prettifying with paint when the wind and sun would only beat you back down to plain again. Right?
Mhm.
And so that's third person. But you do feel like this is Izzy's judgment, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I read a couple of others in the no character anywhere genre? Okay, so the first one, I have here a kind of electronic book, so it's appropriate that I'm reading this on it. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? And
Yep.
he even blows up the Earth in chapter 1, spoiler. So starting with the description of the Earth and humanity, really has no direct relevance to the plot. It certainly obviously drives the protagonist as a memory, but it's very quickly reduced to mostly harmless, and then it's not even that. So but it's it sets the tone, right?
But it establishes the guide as a character.
It does, and it establishes the relative insignificance of the Earth. Right.
Well, so again, I'm going to revisit this. We're not talking about the Earth as the world. We know that, right?
Right.
We're talking about the world is the sort of the universe within the pages of the story.
Right. No, I mean that the Earth is insignificant in the galaxy of the Hitchhiker's Guide.
Absolutely, and that is part of the perspective of that universe.
That's very important. It is the alien perspective, right? It's not the perspective of Arthur Dent. It's the perspective of the guide, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the publishers of the guide. Okay, this next one also is appropriate to read on electronic. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. That first sentence is why I read the entire Neuromancer trilogy. But we get.
I note once again we're at science fiction westerns.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
My children do not understand what that line means.
Well, that's the thing. I have the 10th anniversary edition of the Neuromancer, and already, which is like the 1990s. Already, William Gibson was pointing out in his new introduction that TV tuned to a dead channel is like this particular shade of blue now, and is no longer snow.
Yes.
And so it's dated in a literal way.
Yeah.
And so a modern reader might get the completely wrong idea of what color that sky is.
Yeah.
But it's still kind of a technology-based sky, right? It's still this electric blue instead of this snow.
Right.
So
it doesn't really matter whether the sky is blue or not in that scene.
No, it just has to evoke the technology. And the next sentence is actually introduces the protagonist, right? So he does really, from that one sentence setup, that's the whole world. And then now you're inside a bar in the next sentence. It's not like I'm using, Case heard someone say, as he shouldered his way through the crowd around the door of the chat. It's like my body's developed this massive drug deficiency. It was a sprawl voice and a sprawl joke. The Chatsubu was a bar for professional expatriates. You could drink there for a week and never hear 2 words in Japanese. So that's the second paragraph, and that sets up the protagonist kind of, because as someone who observes and watches, and the whole scene and what country you're in, and the mystery of what is the sprawl and all of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I have a couple more for us. One is a parade in Erhen Rang from the archives of Hain, transcript of Ansible document number Gethin to the stabile on Olol. Report from Genli I, first mobile on Gethin winter, Hainish cycle 93, ecumenical year 1490 to 97. I'll make my report as if I told a story, for I was taught as a child on my homeworld that truth is a matter of the imagination. The soundest fact may fail or prevail in the style of its telling, like that singular organic jewel of our seas, which grows brighter as one woman wears it, and worn by another dulls and goes to dust. Facts are no more solid, coherent, round, and real than pearls are, but both are sensitive. That's The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. And I think it's fascinating. I just think the idea that truth is a matter of the imagination and the soundest fact may fail or prevail in the style of its telling is partly what we're talking about. So it's got this sort of interesting meta kind of tone, but at the same time, as a science fictional thing, you know, that sort of intro that places us in the archives of Haynes seems very sort of hard and science fictional. But the opening is actually much more friendly and character-based, which I think is yet another interesting reflection of how the story proceeds from that point. Yep. Then there's this one.
Okay.
If I can find it, hang on. Lest anyone should suppose that I am a cuckoo's child, got on the wrong side of the blanket by lusty peasant stock and sold into indenture in a short-fallen season, I may say that I am house-born and reared in the night court proper for all the good it did me. That is one sentence. It's the start of Kushil's Dart by Jacqueline Carey.
Oh, yes.
And it's so dripping with meanings and world pieces and all kinds of judgments and social information and attitude information. It's got a ton of things about lots of levels of what's about to happen. The thing about it is you don't have to enter a story in a complicated way, but you need to enter it in a way that is going to reflect how you will continue in some way.
Greg Van Eekhout in California Bones.
Mm-hmm.
1. Daniel Blackland's clearest memory of his father was from the day before his 6th birthday, when they walked hand in hand down Santa Monica Beach. That was the day Daniel found the kraken spine in the Sound. So we have California, and there's going to be actual krakens. Just all set out there, and there you go.
Yeah.
That's a great first sentence.
Yeah. So here is here's one paragraph. I'm going to read the paragraph. It's 01, initiation. The tower, which was not supposed to be there, plunges into the earth in a place just before the black pine forest begins to give way to swamp and then the reeds and wind-gnarled trees of the marsh flats. Beyond the marsh flat, that's the first sentence. Beyond the marsh flats and the natural canals lie the ocean and, a little farther down the coast, a derelict lighthouse. All of this is part of the country that has been abandoned for decades, for reasons that are not easy to relate. Our expedition was the first to enter Area X for more than 2 years, and much of our predecessors' equipment had rusted, their tents and sheds little more than husks. Looking out over that untroubled landscape, I do not believe any of us could yet see the threat. That's Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer.
Mm-hmm.
Which is beautifully evocative of place, and it does all the key elements of the novel are in that paragraph: the lighthouse, the tower, the landscape, which is a major character, in a very active way. You know, like you're kind of struggling with the landscape in that book, and so that's a beautiful sets up. Not only sets up the world and the expectation and the mystery of it all, like Area X, right, which kind of evokes Area 51 and X-Files at the same time, right? And the tower that shouldn't be there. Well, why shouldn't it be there? And why does it descend? You know, and if it's a tower and things like that. And then he makes all these promises to the reader and then fulfills them beautifully in the book. It's just lovely.
Yeah. So here's the thing. This is this is supposed to be one of the introductory world building concepts, right?
Yes.
And mostly we've been looking at quotes, which are great, but they're not really beginner stuff.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if you guys have thoughts about if you're trying to write a world entry, what are you trying to keep in mind? I mean, we have just a couple more minutes left, but I don't mind running over 5 minutes if you don't. What do you think we keep in mind as we try to bring readers in with us?
Well,
I try to bring in some setting, but you also have to get immediately to character in middle grade fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of, but you have to get there immediately. And I also will say that at least for like one of the first iterations of the Fashion Mages book, it started too late. And very often you'll find people are like, oh, I had to cut the first 5 chapters because I started way too early. So I actually ended up with the opposite problem. And in a critique group, people were like, I am so lost. And so I needed to go back and literally write the character walking up to school, like arriving and walking into school, and set, like, give that lead in. And it's a very literal lead in.
Yeah.
But it works for what I'm trying to establish. The book itself is not working right now, but I'm going to get to that.
One thing at a time.
Yes.
So,
but I ended up, so like having the character arrive at school, their thoughts and feelings about that. They're arriving at school, they run into their rival. There's descriptions of the school. So like you get everything in there in the first immediately. You get the lead character, you get the major set piece. And you get what the school is and what it does and what they're there for.
So major concepts, right?
Yeah. So I got all that in. And I had to because I threw people in way too late.
Sure.
In the first version, and everybody was really confused.
I think one of the things that gets us trapped is that there has been this writing advice floating around for a long time that says we should start with action. And people misinterpret that and think that we should start with like some kind of big battle or something, or a fight or a conflict. When what you need to do is, as you lead in, you need to provide clues as to the meaning of what's going on. And if you need a lot of context to understand the meaning of what's going on, then you need to provide that context before you can really get into that conflict, right? I mean, there's got to be tension no matter where you start. But at the same time, context and setting expectations are hugely important. And you don't want to jump into some kind of interaction, the meaning of which will be opaque to a reader because they have no context with which to judge it, right?
I'm going to quietly say rules are meant to be broken, but overall, I think the thing that Cliff has been talking about a lot that I agree with is that readers have expectations, and Jed Hartman, and I don't know if he gets this from other people, talks about author points and says that you have to spend them carefully. And what he means by that is that the reader will give a certain amount of slack to the author as they're reading along, but you can lose things very easily by confusing, by going too fast, by going too slow, by having unlikable characters. And so each of these decisions has to be made mindfully with an awareness of exactly how much work that you're asking a reader to do and how easy you're making it for the reader.
Yeah.
And also that if you make it too easy, you'll lose some other readers who want more challenge.
Yeah.
But these are very genre dependent. And there are conventions for the genre. If you're writing a mystery, you start with a body, or you have to reveal the body relatively early. If you're starting with a fantasy, you often want to start with either the quest or the scene. Starting with science fiction, you want to start with the technology. If you're starting with a story about high school, you often want to start with walking into the high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are rhythms that people want in order to flow them into the story and flow them into the world, and that
they can be genre based.
So the thing that you're doing is partly the where do you start your story and what are you going to tell, and then there's the thing that you've been talking about with the what words are you using and how are you evoking it and what rhythms are you using and what words are you using and not using. Are you inside the character's head? Are you looking over? Is this a very distant narrator? Is there a prologue? So this is all either you're going to begin as you're going to go on, or you're going to begin to create a deliberate contrast to play off with shortly after. But the first chapter is about setting the scene and hooking the reader so that they'll keep reading.
Yep.
Because normally, not many people do this anymore because they're not going to books and motor bookstores. But it used to be a thing that a person would look at the spine, possibly know something about the publisher or not, look at the title. Maybe the author's lucky and the book is already faced out. They see the cover and they go, oh, it's got dragons on it, or oh, it's got spaceships on it. Open it up, start the first chapter, and start reading that first few pages to get an idea of what was going to happen.
Yep.
And maybe they'd keep just reading and just go, I can't put this down, I need to go buy this. Or they would say, all right, I don't know, does it change at all? And like flip into chapter 3 and see if the tone was consistent. But that was normally the way a book was bought. So marketing wise, there was a real need to set that hook early.
Well, and I was in a workshop at a long ago, and basically the point that I wanted to bring to this discussion from it is the purpose of your first sentence is to get people to read your second sentence.
Yeah.
Right. So establishing curiosity is really important. And curiosity can be established just by confusing the reader slightly with the first sentence. Sometimes that can be helpful. Or maybe, there are lots of ways to make people curious, right? Confuse them a little, or show them somebody who has an attitude they can't explain, or show them a place that seems really intriguing and they can't figure out. I mean, there's a lot of different stuff there, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it would have to be a workshop if I really wanted to get into the whole word by word thing, which is too bad because it's really difficult to talk about. But I should do that sometime.
We should do like some workshops maybe. I don't know. I mean, I suppose like people should need to like pay for that privilege though.
Probably.
Well, I'm just gonna note that it's a really fun exercise to do write the first sentence and then figure out if you can write a first sentence that lets people know what your genre is, what your setting is, and what's going to happen without being a Bulwer-Lytton contest winner.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, I'm not sure like that it's that hard. I mean, I think it it definitely takes effort, sort of, but it's like, I don't know, I just sort of view it as like you ease in a little,
Yeah.
So I don't know if I've just sort of like if this is something like, I mean, I know everybody says, sweat blood over your first 3 chapters, and
do they say that?
People
Who
do,
says
yeah,
that?
because that is like the only, because that first 20 to 50 pages is your only entry for an agent, possibly, and you may get less than that, you may get more than that.
I mean,
So,
I rework things all the time. I just have never heard that particular sweat blood.
Well, I mean, I don't think they maybe say it exactly like that.
I'm sure some people do. But
I'm sure.
Yeah.
you get all kinds of advice. What we haven't talked about is starting with dialogue.
Yep.
First
Yeah.
sentence of well, it's a short story, but the first sentence of one of my favorites that I wrote is, it's one sentence, it's one word, it's dialogue. And then the next sentence is the response of the person who the dialogue was aimed at.
Here's a book that starts with dialogue. Chapter 1, third. I've watched through his eyes, I've listened through his ears, and I tell you he's the one, or at least as close as we're going to get. That's what you said about the brother. The brother tested out impossible for other reasons, nothing to do with his ability. This is Ender's Game. And
We started out as a novella.
completely unadorned dialogue. Basically, you definitely get the sense that you're overhearing some people who do not want to be overheard.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I've seen. Then let's start it off. Life as a novella, right? So I've seen the dialogue openings used more frequently with shorter fiction than with novels, at least lately. I think novel, you have more of a chance to set the stage, right? And you could start with the far away look and zoom in, or whatever. Like The Hobbit, I'm not going to read it, but The Hobbit famously starts with the description of what kind of hole a hobbit hole is not, right? Yeah. And then it tells you what it is, and that means comfort, right? You know, and suddenly it's turned the idea of like a hole in the ground, you know, into something positive instead of the negative association the reader might have brought with it. So I tried to, with each example I read, I tried to point out what I liked about it. I think an opening gives you the opportunity to set the tone, like the different tone between, say, Neuromancer and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is quite obvious, right? It tells you, even before you, even a setting aside describing character and setting, is the language describes the kind of book you're in, right? Or the kind of story you're in. And so, you know, I mean, it's a daunting task. Definitely, I think that the readers now download the sample of the ebook, which might be the first chapter or two, and they can't go to the third chapter, you know, as Kat says, and see if the tone changes. They can only base on the beginning. And if you hook them in the first sentence of the ebook, they'll read the second sentence and the third sentence. And then if you keep them hooked up to the end of the sample, they may buy it when it says, sample's over, you want to buy this book, you know?
Yeah.
Or if they're reading the sample, you know, on like Amazon or whatever, they're going to buy the paperback or the hardcover because they're not an ebook reader, but they're reading the sample on their screen. They get to the end of the sample and like, order the book or not order the book, right?
Yeah.
Well, so that is your pitch to the reader. So it makes sense too. It's also the pitch to the agent and the editor initially anyway. So it makes sense to really focus on your opening. But that said, there's all sorts of kinds of openings that work.
Yeah.
Right? And
there are a lot of ways to make people curious.
Yeah. The ones that work best are working in multiple levels, right? Like they introduce character, place, setting, tone, all of this. And it's like they're firing on all cylinders and they're just things of beauty, right? So read it aloud would be my advice, right? And then like read it to other people maybe aloud, like, you know, accost people in grocery stores. No, but you know.
I don't think that would be a good plan.
Yeah.
But you know, like whatever, people can tell you whether they're confused by a beginning and when it's not necessarily clear to you. Right?
Well, on the other hand, yeah. So some works lend themselves very well to being delivered verbally, and others don't.
Sure.
But I think we're going to have to wrap this up. We got started late, so I don't mind running a little late. But I'm going to have to go and do things like, you know, dinner. So
yeah, food.
Thank you all for your contributions and your thoughts. I really do want to do a workshop, but I just haven't figured out how to run it logistically. So.
Webinar
that's
style,
the
like we all pay money and do stuff. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I would love to. I would love
We
to.
all pay money and do stuff. That's our
Well, I mean, I'm more specific than that, obviously, but I mean, that's
have
the
you?
general.
Kat, are you talking?
Yeah, Cat Rambo's been running web-based and Google Hangout-based writing seminars for a
Yeah.
while, and you know, basically she does it as if you were there in person, but you know, sets the writing prompts and has everybody meet up, and it's very much like what you do in person, except that she has people reading out aloud their excerpts and discussing them, and
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I took her
I
short
think it
story
works
class.
really gorgeously. I did a how to keep working on your novel beyond the first chapter, I think it was. So
That's cool. I mean, I've taught through her school. I have a course that I give on linguistics for genre writers.
Oh my god,
Cool.
it's so good.
Yeah, so
fun.
and I think
So
I'm going to
good.
give that again. I'm going to be doing it live on I believe it's June the 3rd. So if you're interested in that, you can go look over on Kat's website. But in the meantime, I think we better stop the broadcast. I think somebody had suggested something that I thought was a good idea for next time. Oh, it was the how to develop a genre concept.
Is that what my like sort of like what if take your
Yeah,
what if and
it's
embellish from
basically
there?
how to take. It's the idea of how to take a sort of a single kernel of an idea of a MacGuffin of some variety and consider its worldwide impacts. Does that make sense? The impact of your MacGuffin. That could be the title of the topic. Yeah. Anyway, so we're going to meet next week, as I understand it. No reason to change the date. If something comes up, I will let you know. But thank you all for being here, and I will stop the broadcast.
Thank you for having us.
Good.